So the typical question is buy or build, and that's the one that we hear most often in the world of entrepreneurship and scale-ups. Today's show is really all about what if you could buy and then build, and what's that all about? There's a book. It's a great topic. I really loved recording this show. I think you'll get a lot out of it. How do we use buying and then improving as a growth strategy, acquisition growth, or even starting with something that's already built and then building on top of it? What are the lessons learned? How do you go about that? That's what today's show is all about, with a really great, engaging guest. Listen in. If you've been listening to our podcast or you've read the book Scaling Up, you might be interested in our workshop on the Scaling Up Growth Framework for your own business. We have a workshop coming soon to San Francisco, and we have a few $100 discounts for our loyal podcast listeners while supplies last. Just go to scalingcoach.com/workshops and then enter the code SUP. That's SUP for Scaling Up Podcast when you register. We'll see you there. Hello and welcome again to the Scaling Up Business Podcast. I'm your host and scaling coach, Bill Gallagher. On the show with me today is Walker Deibel. So Walker's co-founded 3 startups. He's acquired 7 others, and he's exited 2 of them. He's got an MBA from the Olin School of Business Management at Washington University in St. Louis, and he's the author of a book, Buy Then Build. So we're talking about acquisition today, and acquisition versus building everything yourself, the value of that. You're in St. Louis today with your family?
That's right. Here in St. Louis, Bill. Thanks for having me.
How old are your kids? What's the family like?
They're 8, 6, and 4. 3 girls.
Wow. 8, 6, and 4. Yeah, mine are 22 and going on 20.
Boy, you get me started talking about kids. I mean, this is going to be a whole different hour than what I had planned.
Buy then build. Yeah. You got to build in the kid department. I suppose you could go on the acquisition, right? You could adopt. That's true. The equivalent. So talk to us give us a little bit of your background for our listeners about your entrepreneurial journey. Did it start as a kid? Did you start buying businesses on the playground?
Wow. Yeah. I'm not that kid that had, the newspaper route or anything like that. There was a very short stint where my dad had actually bought a automatic knife sharpener. And I made some flyers and put them in the mailboxes and tried to get some business sharpening knives. But I got one customer and there was no repeat business. So it never really took off. It wasn't until much later when I became a professional that I sort of realized, I determined pretty quickly that if I was going to be putting my own labor into, working hard and building something, that I really wanted to make sure I could do it for myself, or at least, be in a small group of people that were making decisions for the business.
Yeah. So take us through the whole arc. Like, how did it develop? Where did you some of your business mistakes? And I know we talked about it beforehand, and I know about the grad school, but I think our listeners would love to hear about that.
Sure. So, the concept behind Buy Then Build is really what I call acquisition entrepreneurship. In other words, I believe that, entrepreneurship is a bit more of a condition, and that there's multiple ways to do it, right? It's more a condition than, say, a job or a role, right?
Like psoriasis.
We are. Yeah, exactly.
Gout.
So right. So I think most of us would agree with that. I mean, you go to an EO meeting or anything like this, and everyone's like, "Oh, I'm an entrepreneur because I can't keep a job, or
right.
whatever." We're in one regard we're the rebels, in the other we're the officers. Which one is it, right? Let's see. I think that probably a good place to start would be that while I was at WashU getting an MBA, me and a few of my friends started a company. And we had licensed the rights to this technology for point of purchase advertising. Okay. And we were getting big in streams with a major national retailer. We were the finalist in the business plan competition. We had momentum. We were pitching for funds, and it basically all fell apart. The month that I graduated, And that's fine. I mean, that's almost why you do it in grad school, right? Because it's like, hey, I'm protected. I'm a student, or whatever.
No, you're supposed to launch the idea, drop out of school, and the company's supposed to succeed.
That's right. That's right.
Get your degree and the company fails.
That's right.
They're
That's
not
right.
reading the right books.
That's exactly right. However, we all know that as entrepreneurs, startups fail. We all know that. In fact, Bill, we know from Scaling Up that, Vern's book, that only 4% of companies in the United States ever exceed $1 million in revenue, right?
Yeah.
And when you couple that with, with the fact that, we all know the axiom that, 9 out of 10 startups kind of fail. So that one that makes it, there's a very small chance that it's going to succeed from there. So you're right. We're all supposed to drop out of school and have the business launch, but more common than not, that's not actually what happens. And I was a victim of that same exact statistic. Perhaps it's punishment for not understanding statistics. So the startup fails, right? And this is sort of when I come to this conclusion that entrepreneurship is a bit more of a condition. In other words, I didn't have some kind of big idea. I just made the rounds for 18 months raising capital around this other idea, and everyone had heard my pitch. And so I knew that there was a way to find a business to buy, or rather to buy a business. And so I started down that path. And I was probably the only MBA grad that didn't have a job secure because we had so much momentum, right? So I started on this path, and I'm sort of met with this really opaque, fragmented industry where the M&A advisors or brokers or intermediaries or investment bankers, I mean, what did all of that mean? And like, why were they different? They were all sort of peddling the same goods. And it was one of these where the businesses that I could find for sale, the deal flow was absolutely horrible. And what I was looking for at that time was what that was 2004, Buy Then Build was released in 2018, the end of 2018. So it took me that long to sort of, kind of figure it out on my own. And that it's really the resource that I needed when I was getting started.
Mm-hmm. So what was the first business you bought?
The first business I ended up buying so I failed in that whole endeavor, right? Like literally someone tried to sell me a pet cemetery, and as someone who, was into startups and understood adolescent markets and, had an MBA, I was not looking to, make $20 a month from, former pet owners while I cut the grass or something like that. I was looking for something that I could, build and accelerate to new heights. I ended up kind of failing in that first journey looking for that acquisition, and I went corporate. And what ended up happening was I about a year later kind of started my search again and ended up buying a book printing company. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now it was a very, very weird decision externally. Okay. Mm-hmm. And here's why, Bill. I bought the company in 2008. And if you remember what was going on at that time, like the iPad was coming out, Kindle was making headlines, ebooks were thriving, right? Mm-hmm. Bookstores were just starting to get soft. Newspapers were just starting to get soft. We had no idea what was really about to happen with the real estate crash and all the rest of it. Bookstores were going out of business. Newspapers were trying to. Yeah. It was horrible.
It was already threatened by the internet. Like at that point,
right.
I was reading the news on my laptop in bed, and I was a couple of years into leaving the paper out in the driveway. It would only be like Sunday mornings that I would go get the thick,
That's right. So the thing was that it was perceived as not a mature industry, but actually a declining one. So it wasn't only people, in my age group that weren't going into that industry, but also, the for lack of a better description, the gray hairs weren't exactly, wanting to get involved in that industry either. Everyone was running from the printing industry. Here's what I saw. I looked at the underlying trends of what was happening. And at that time, what I saw was, Amazon was actually pushing the volume of new titles. It went from, I'm a little rusty on the numbers, but you're talking like 3,000 new ISBNs a year to over 300,000. Self-publishing was exploding. And something else happened as well. What happened was digital book printing became good enough. And this had never really happened before in the industry. And so what Amazon was pushing was people were buying books online. which was driving innovation in digital printing. And so these long tail kind of books that were out of print because there was no demand, all of a sudden could be serviced. So publishing companies were just now starting to turn over to just-in-time inventory. So there was opportunity there, right? Mm-hmm. So I bought a company that had about 125, 150 publishers as their customers. Okay. Mm-hmm. I made a small down payment, took a huge loan. And then I used the cash flow from the business to, I knocked down some walls. I put in a digital book printing facility, started selling that product to existing customers of the company. And, within 18 months, it was about 20-25% of the business. And we were using that product as our, the tip of the spear in discussions with new customers and expanding the company.
Interesting. Yeah. So you picked a trend, you bought into an existing business, you leveraged that into making it a different business.
That's right. That's right. And if you're familiar with, I don't know if you want to go this direction, but if you're familiar with real estate investing, buying a company is very, very similar, where, it's basically a leverageable asset, where in comparison to a startup, it's kind of like, equity infusion on future earnings, speculative, right, as opposed to proven historical track record.
Right. So better to buy into a business that's in an industry that's on decline, into a business where there's a motivated seller, than something that looks clearly like it's a winner. Or at least in terms of value.
Yeah. So I mean, in my opinion, you just said better to buy a declining business and change it. In my opinion, there's 4 different opportunity profiles, and I think that's definitely one of them. That's definitely one of them.
That's one of them. Yeah. Well, I did the same years ago when I was in the radio business. I wasn't the CEO, but I was an officer in the company, and we were buying up failing radio stations and then flipping them to new markets.
Tell me, will you expand on that?
And
story.
Some of that story is not ready for.
Well, let me ask you this: Were you growing through acquisition, or were you sort of buying?
Yeah, mostly. So no, we would buy an underperforming radio station, right, in a major market, usually major markets, right? We'd go into Houston and we buy a station that had a lot of gospel on it. This is a winning example of them. And we'd look and we'd say, wow, there's a substantial, so this is failing as a gospel station, but there's a substantial population here of Vietnamese, and we should make a Vietnamese station in this town. So we would then turn that secondary signal that wasn't so hot, wasn't really winning, into all Vietnamese.
I love this example because here's what happened. Yeah. When people start a business from scratch, what they're trying to do is essentially build an infrastructure, right? What you were buying wasn't necessarily the gospel station at all. You were buying the infrastructure. Everyone knew that, whatever, 101.5 was a station. People knew, there was probably offices or recording studios. There was people there doing it. And you were just sort of changing a little piece of the offering that had a drastic impact on what happened there locally. That's a great example. Great example.
Yeah. I just spent the last couple of days coaching in a prison, coaching and mentoring serious maximum security prisoners on entrepreneurship and job skills. It was a deeply moving experience. We have a show coming up on that soon that we'll post with Kat Hoke. But what was cool about that is many of them came in there like, okay, I have this vision for a barber shop, or I have a vision for a food truck, or I have a vision for a car wash, or they had these different ideas. And at first they were like, we're going to build this, we're going to do that. I'm like, why don't you just buy a failed food truck and then convert it and, put a cool design on the thing and make it your menu, and right, instead of trying to do everything from scratch. And people love that idea. Somebody was like, I want to do a barbershop combined with a car wash. And he had this whole vision for how it's a family weekend thing to make families better. I'm like, that's awesome. Go pursue your vision, but don't try to do both of them. Just get the little storefront or the corner of the car wash that's not doing well and open the barbershop part of it.
So, Bill, here's what I would say. Like you're hitting on something that's really awesome. However, again, I talk with a lot of, family offices and private equity and even acquisition entrepreneurs that want to do exactly what you say. They'll say, oh, I'm looking for the same deal everyone else is, $1 million in EBITDA, totally run down, tired, not doing well, and I can get in and fix it, right? Now, if you actually look at, but the thing is that you equally, those same prison mates, if that's the right term, could actually look at a car wash that's doing fantastic. Why don't you buy that one? You don't have to do anything, right? So the point is they got the location right. They've got the branding right. I mean, maybe it needs a new coat of paint, but the thing is that when you look at the historical earnings, yes, you might be paying a little bit more because it's not exhausted, but it might turn out to be a better investment for someone who maybe isn't as savvy at like the turnaround, kind of skill set. And so that's another one of the four.
Well, in their case, right, and this is maybe relevant for all of us. In their case, they had a hard thing. Like all of their pitches were, they wanted to figure out how to create something for $5,000 startup costs.
I see.
Right. So what can they do for $5,000 out of pocket and be cash positive in 6 months?
Well, that's a different question.
Right. That's a different thing.
Yes.
But it's a different show, right? But here's the thing I think that's interesting about it is that we all have certain constraints and pressures around like paying our rent and like. So talk to us about back to your story about the exit of Corley and then what was the next business?
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about that. So kind of in the same lines of what we're thinking, what I realized was, even though we had this great early success in terms of, building out the digital book printing facility, what happened was we really hit a glass ceiling. I needed an infrastructure that we didn't have. And what that infrastructure was simply the ability to, Cliff's Notes version, I wanted people to be able to get quotes online, send their files online, have them automatically ripped, put on 2 different presses, color and black and white, automatic barcodes, married, bound, out, right? It sounds simple today because it's something that we're familiar with, but back then, that wasn't something that was off the shelf. I mean, this was a full custom built thing. And when I talked to dev teams, it was coming with a 7-figure sort of investment. And number one, I didn't have the money, I had maybe $5,000, I didn't have the money, but also, just building out that additional infrastructure didn't necessarily guarantee more customers, which of course is the goal. And what I knew was that, the success that we had, it sort of made us, this sounds more impressive than it is, but we had succeeded in becoming one of the largest 2% of printing companies in the US and Canada. Okay. And there's, probably because everyone else was sort of having a hard time. But the thing was that I knew that there were smaller digital book printing startups that had sort of, been out there, and they were basically using this digital ordering infrastructure to service those customers. And I knew that I could actually acquire an existing business, get the customers, because it was this, I would be a strategic buyer in this sense. I'd be able to increase the net profits of the company because I already had the overhead. Okay. And so I was looking for that very specific infrastructure that would help us break through that glass ceiling and get to the next level. I spent 2.5 years looking at 27 different acquisition targets, and not all of them were for sale, right? I looked at hundreds, but, real conversations with everything from, really high tech, like straight out of the startup accelerator to even, really mature printing companies that had done something similar to what we had done, like in terms of, trying to make a go at the digital side. And this ultimately led to, number one, a huge learning curve, right? But second, it led to finding the absolute perfect fit. All right. I was in St. Louis. This other company was based in Chicago. They had another facility down south. They were 100%, digital book printing. We were, call it 75% offset book printing. So this, had a geographic expansion. They had the most robust online ordering system in any true B2B printing format. And they weren't for sale. I spoke with them. Well, I don't know, let's get through the election. A few months went by and, I'm sort of painting this vision and this picture. And the guy came back and said, okay, listen, I love your vision. We absolutely have to do it. And I'm like, great, that's great. And he said, but I just want to change one little thing. I want to buy you instead. And so, where I'm going with this is that, acquisition entrepreneurship is not necessarily just the best way to start. It's also, we can talk about growing through acquisition, but it's the most effective and fastest way to grow. And it's the best for most people. And by doing these activities that are leading to the outcomes that you want, it might ultimately be the best way to exit your company as well.
We've done this quite a few times with and sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, or with more success and more difficult success in some other cases. I think most of them have been pretty successful in the end, but we start with a company. We bring in scaling up. They start to do stuff. We create the BHAG and the purpose and the values. We work on the culture. We implement good execution habits. We tighten up the business model. Then we start acquisition. We start pulling companies into that thing. And that was some good growth. Yeah.
Point of order is growing through acquisition part of sort of the scaling up. Is that in your toolbox? Is that something that's scaling up? Really
many of our folks have done it. Once they get the core thing in the core company, right, the core operating system in there, and we're starting to build, and we've got a leadership team that's got at least some key people. Then we start to acquire companies often, and there are a lot of different ways of the financing and that in there. It's not implied or required, but it's really common. Some of the things though that I notice are, one, if we're doing the scaling up framework first, and then we start to acquire, it's a lot easier. One company that we did scaling up with, we had already done 9 acquisitions. Then they're like, okay, we've got some leadership alignment issues and some cultural issues. Let's bring in scaling up. But by then it was a lot harder. And that company was successfully sold, but they probably would have liked to have run it up a little bit more first. And they probably would, it probably would have been a lot easier had we done not,
absolutely. Order, right? Absolutely. So I was a producer on a film called Print the Legend, which, if you ask me, is one of the best films ever made on entrepreneurship. But the scene in the movie where they sort of bring in adult supervision, and she says, I think to the camera, like, I'm here to essentially put a spine in a jellyfish. I'm putting a backbone in a jellyfish. If you grow through acquisition before you're ready for it, it's going to create chaos, right? So what you're doing is setting the foundation right, and then using acquisitions as an accelerator for growth instead of, having to sort of go in and put a backbone in a jellyfish or pull a bunch of pieces together.
Well, and that culture is really critical, right? You got to align the culture of everything. And so who's getting acquired has got to get absorbed into all of the culture, and then all the operating practices and the larger vision and strategy of the acquiring company. But that who's going to acquire who is often a subject of some conversation.
In grad school, I heard that it's something like it's over 50% of acquisitions don't actually extract the value that they expected that they would in an acquisition. And it has to do ultimately with culture, right? I mean, it's like we all, all the analysts sit in the back room, they run the numbers, everything logically makes sense. And then once you get in there, it's and the thing is that I think it was Bill Gates. I mean, somebody of note, some iconoclastic entrepreneur said, whatever you're accelerating, is basically what you're growing. So in other words, if you don't have that foundation tight and right and ready to go, and instead you're inefficient, when you start scaling it up, and maybe it was Vern Harnish, when you start scaling it up, all you're growing is your inefficiencies. So, tying your shoelaces at the start line is really important.
Yeah. Well, I was founder and CEO of a couple tech businesses before, and then a senior person in another one. And somebody asked me at one of these startup pitch conference things, I already was down the road a little bit on it. And they said, well, if you'd not had 500,000 when you started, right, which is about what we had put into the whole first year of the business from outside to inside. But what if you'd had 5 million? And I said, oh, I know exactly what I would have done. I would have made the same mistakes in a much grander scale and with better chairs.
I think that's exactly right. And
better office furniture.
you know what? I mean, just to pull it back also into buy then build, it's the thing is a lot of entrepreneurs believe that, you know, the best way that we have to start a business is through venture capital. And what we've learned from research at Harvard is that 75% of VC-backed startups actually end up going to zero. That is a lot better than, say, the 10%, right, that sort of succeed without venture capital. But you're talking about, like, on average, it's like $46 million put into each one of these things, and there's still a 75% failure rate. So I from my experience, I completely agree with that as well. I would definitely have a nicer chair as we ride down into flames.
Right. Well, you learn things about it, and hopefully you apply them to the next one. I was at brunch actually yesterday with a guy who was like, he's like, I had a whole string of failures. And he's like, well, maybe they weren't all total failures, but they like far didn't exceed. What's that word? They fought the vast majority missed expectations by a profound amount. And even if they broke even, and many were ultimately dissolved. I said, well, for how long? What was this losing streak? And he said, it was about 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was he a startup guy? Was he doing startups?
He was doing largely startups. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I'll keep it. That's a show for another day.
Well, not really, because let's talk about that. Because what I found is that there was a whole chapter in the book that I ultimately eliminated, and it was all about entremetrics, is what I called it. Right, and the concept is this: we're taught as entrepreneurs that fail fast, fail often, take a lot of at bats. Right? I mean, that's what these sort of like magazine cover entrepreneurs say. Right? Like, oh, I did all this 100 times and whatever. And sometimes it works, but the truth is that that movie Moneyball, right, where the Boston Red Sox basically focused on changing the metrics so that they could afford it, and they focused on get on base. Let's get on base. This is the only way we can beat these home run companies. Entremetrics is the same exact thing, because buying an existing company builds in three things. One, an investment with an ROI as opposed to a speculative, let's build this. Number two, it builds in a margin of safety for the entrepreneur and for the investor. And three, it's got major upside potential, just like any startup does.
Yeah. I love that aspect. And I think we see a lot of folks, if you have a good exit, and then you get out there and you try to do the next one and it bombs, and you're like, oh my God, what happened? There went all my money, because you think you're a genius at business. You're like, I'm brilliant. I've got the magic touch. I built a great team. But your second time attempting to build a team fails miserably, and you get into a business you don't really understand. And
like, a little bit of hubris comes with entrepreneurship, I think.
Let's talk about the EDC business. And that move into a different
almost
segment.
Case in point. Let me tell the story, if you don't mind. So basically, after I sold the printing company, I kind of, to your point, went right back into a tech startup. And let me explain this, Bill. We had a mobile software for the enterprise. Okay, we our equity raise was oversubscribed. We had recruited an executive from Microsoft to be our CEO. We had a proven dev team. We had the CTO from another major Fortune 500 firm working with us. We had beta programs running at over a dozen major companies. You would know them. And we went through one of the top 10 accelerator programs in the world. And yet, 14 months later, we were completely out of cash, no paying customers, all the rest of it. Okay. And on paper, it looked great in terms of what we had. Now you could say, hey, they didn't have enough time to pivot, or they didn't have enough they didn't have product market fit. Or, at the end of the day, it's all about, are you generating enough revenue to cover the expense of your infrastructure? Okay. Enough gross margin. We couldn't get there in time. All right. And what happened was, the broker that I ended up working with on the buy side at the printing company ended up calling me and saying, "Hey, Walker, how's that startup going?" I was like, "Gary, it's a little rocky right now. I'm leading a reorg and there's 3 people in the organization." And he said, "Good, there's this business down here. You got to come take a look at it. It's a perfect fit for you." And I was like, "Well, I mean, okay." So, I jumped in the car and I drove about, 3.5 hours and I met the sellers. And just kind of right away, I had this overwhelming feeling that this was just not going to work. The building was fine, but kind of in a remote area of this, somewhat rural area of Missouri. It just seemed like kind of a tired, rundown industry or whatever. And the thing was that when I got there and I sort of had that hot take, like this wasn't going to work, it was a 3.5 hour drive. So everyone knew that I didn't accidentally have somewhere else to be. Like I was there. Okay. I'm there for 90 minutes at least. Right. Yeah. I mean,
Can't make it.
So I sit down and I have this meeting, and all of a sudden a lot of things just kind of shake out of this meeting. Okay. Number one, I found out that, the company had I don't want to sort of echo the sort of tough times that we were talking about earlier, but they had a major person in the organization that had left about, 6 months ago. And they just weren't quite back to normal. They were a little soft in their operations, which was an opportunity to increase profitability. But what they really had that was really special to me was they had this really kind of antiquated DOS-like ordering system, okay, where that this guy had the vision to put in, but it was just ugly. And so it was one of these where they had about 70 different customer locations logging into this thing and placing orders for product. And when I looked at it, it was like, wait a minute. And there was one person at the place at a customer location that could order because it required training. It was awkward. It was hard. There was no way that I was going to be able to talk to a new customer and get them to do this. It was just like the company had been around for 45 years and this was there. So there was that infrastructure that was so sticky that I was like, oh my gosh. So I acquired EDC with, again, a small down payment and kind of a small business administration loan, SBA loan. Did that about 6 years ago. And basically, again, used the cash flow of the business to build out a proprietary e-commerce storefront for companies with multiple locations. And, we've increased our skill set, our operations, our profitability, and now we source, manage inventory, and distribute. And we really kind of created this like private Amazon experience for these companies, right? And and now when we go to sell the product to someone else, they immediately get it. It's like, oh my gosh, you're basically increasing my efficiencies and my entire supply chain. And, we can leverage your overhead for the warehouse, et cetera, so on and so forth. So he was so close, and so far, right? So, yes, I'm still president at EDC, and it's a lot of fun. Great company. So let me pull this around. And say one more thing. I got to pull those stories around. Sorry, stop just short. Which was we accomplished everything at EDC that we were trying to accomplish at Viewpoint simply by buying an existing business and turning it into the business that we wanted. And within 18 months, we had I think it was almost 10,000 users of our SaaS product. So everything that was happening there was what we were trying to build. It was the infrastructure we were trying to build. Exiting is basically everything that I try to do is in this acquisition entrepreneurship model. Okay. And so it's always going to be that growth through acquisition that ultimately leads to the exit. And so I think the most glamorous story was actually the one I already shared with Coralie and actually trying to grow through acquisition to that degree. In terms of acquisitions, I've actually been through many, but the large majority of them are actually with a whole different. If we go there, we're going to take this conversation a totally different way. Ultimately, I've had probably 14 different exits. Lots of stories there, but yeah.
Yeah. So I imagine some good, some not good. So I'm guessing from the way you said that there were some that you just like, okay, let's get out of this thing. And then others, it's like, this is the time to get out, like in a positive way.
It's true. I've had both. It's true. I've had both. But most of my exits have actually come in my film career. So I'm a film producer. And what we do is we, develop and finance the creation of films. Yeah. And then we sell them to distributors. So, I've had films at South by, Sundance, Toronto. We've won awards at all of these places, and we've sold for distributorship. Uh-huh. And so ultimately, today, I also work as an M&A advisor and help entrepreneurs exit their companies. Uh-huh. And what I've learned is that it's a direct parallel to everything that I've already done in film production.
In your film work, are you funding, are you buying and selling a film that's already been made, or are you funding the making of a film?
We're making the film. So as a member of the production team, we're putting in funding, we're raising funding, we play a part in the creation process, and ultimately, we're trying to make something that is sellable and then exit the whole product to a distributor.
And is this not an example of build then sell, or is there? I
actually think it's buy then build, and there's a couple of reasons why. Okay, like number one, so take Print the Legend. Okay, it actually was the second ever Netflix original ever. And it was the same week as the first ever. Okay, so we're talking about the thing that started the streamers doing original content. Okay, and they really are growing through acquisition by buying content from guys like us. Ultimately, in film and in acquisition entrepreneurship, you will look at hundreds of projects or companies before you find the one that you're ready to move on. And what I look for is, okay, what's the team in place? What do we know about, the script or the footage that's been shot or whatever? And ultimately, the cash and the financing in a project is usually the thing that takes it from something sort of being shopped around Hollywood to actually being a finished film and sold. And so what I do is I look at what's the sellability of this project before we even start, because I know that we've got to at minimum break even, and we've got to go into this knowing that we're going to make some money for the investors if I'm going to take it around and try to raise capital for that project.
It's kind of hilarious to talk about this because I'm I was born in West LA, right?
Yeah.
And so I grew up around a lot of this kind of stuff, although I don't really have any background in it. But my nephew now is shooting the second season of a Netflix series that's been, he's a lead in a Netflix series. It's The Umbrella Academy, people know. And Aidan Gallagher's the young old kid. Mm-hmm. So but a guy from St. Louis who's bringing some entrepreneurship to film and entertainment is almost amusing, right? From that perspective.
It's one of these where I made a film in college. This was a start from scratch story, and we ended up selling it. It took about 4 years, right? And we ended up selling it to Lionsgate, and that was a big success. We sold it for a fraction of the cost of the budget, which was a huge win in the film industry. And so early on, I was like, the economics here aren't good, are they? My college roommate ended up working on the Paramount lot immediately after school, and so I spent a lot of time on the Paramount lot and just kind of understood, got to learn the sort of dynamic of how the film industry works, and I just sort of realized Hollywood is interesting because it's one of these where someone gets lucky. There's just this external luck, right? That is everyone's out there. You've got to work for a decade, 15 years. But if you are really good, really dedicated, the chances of you making it are just like a startup, not that great. They're just not that great. And so I was like, I don't like the economics. I'm going to go get an MBA, right? And I was really close to going that direction. And then ultimately the sort of 2.0 opportunity came around. And it's very parallel to the buy then build, because you're ultimately buying intellectual property. You're investing in intellectual property that's already been pulled together, as opposed to a starting from scratch project. And I've tried to start films from scratch. And again, it's just like my entrepreneurial journey. They get a lot of momentum and then they kind of fall apart.
Well, they're all industries that have changed too. Like, so I was involved in music for a while, and music has changed dramatically. It used to be you get a record deal, and then there were record sales, and then there were CD sales. But then along came something called Napster, and things changed pretty significantly. And now people make money on the touring and on the merch and on the licensing and things like that. And the broadcast industry has changed really dramatically. First with cable, and now with streaming things, and it's just changing so fast. And yet there is still a way for people to make money, but a lot of people end up as dog food, right?
It's true. It's true. The odds are against you.
So segue into a story that I didn't hear, but I had a note from our producer, the two women standing in the business. What was that all about?
Oh, sure. Okay. I've got this idea where, one of the concepts in the book is that when people go out and try to buy a company, they end up doing it completely the wrong way. Okay. They start looking at the wrong things. The brokers aren't, by and large, aren't even necessarily any better. They're asking the wrong questions because they're ultimately trying to, what's the fastest way that I can process what this guy is going to look for, right? But the thing is that they're not incentivized to sit around and train first-time buyers and hold their hand and get them comfortable. They're just like, what can I put in front of this person that will, sell something that, I've got in my pipeline, or what do I have on my menu? Kind of.
Right.
The thing is that, a lot of times people go in and they're like, well, I don't know what I'm looking for. I just want to kind of, don't do it like that. They go in, they don't have a sense of urgency. They just want to they feel like the seller's trying to sell them something. That's not how this goes. People need to figure out, their attitude, aptitude, and action. Okay. Ultimately figuring out, are they the right person for this kind of job? What is it that they're good at? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And what do they want their everyday activities to look like? Okay. And sort of by spending the time to do the pre-work up front and defining what it is that you're good at is going to help you in the long run. Here's why. When you buy a company, a lot of people will look at the company and say, okay, here's the company I'm thinking about buying. It's a car wash. It's an underperforming car wash, or it's a great car wash, to use your example. The thing is that if it's underperforming or it's great, I've got to know what I bring to the table. This business, after I buy it, is not this business anymore. It's this business plus me, okay? And there's 4 opportunity profiles. You need to understand what your skill set, which opportunity profile is the best way for you as an entrepreneur to drive value. And then you need to use that growth opportunity to identify the business that it is that you want to buy. All right. That's sort of the theory. Okay. Now, I was working with these 2 potential buyers, and they were looking, and like a lot of searchers weren't having a lot of luck. Right. And I basically took that same kind of what I call prep funnel. Okay. I took them through it, and we got to the end, and I said, so basically you're looking for a business that needs, whatever it was, basically like international supply chain management with online marketing. That's the opportunity you're looking for. Long story, but that was where we got to. And they looked at each other and kind of sat back, dramatic pause. And the one said to the other, we should have bought that wine shop. And the other one said, I know. As soon as he started talking, I knew it. And they were standing in this business, and they didn't have that realization. What can I bring to this business? What is the strength that I bring to change what's going to happen? And so they were standing in the company. It had international suppliers everywhere. Okay. It was a small retail shop, but the whole opportunity was online for them. And so this is what they knew, and they missed that opportunity because it ended up selling to somebody else.
Yeah. That online piece of it.
So ultimately, you need to understand what it is you bring to the table and define your search around the opportunity that's going to match your skill set.
So even if you're not going to work in the business, you're going to be contributing something to it, some expertise, some ability, some skill set, some resource, some connection.
Okay, so you're talking about absentee ownership. Okay, so I own a business that I'm absentee.
Well, I'm assuming if I'm buying a business, I'm not going to do a whole lot in it that I'm buying it.
That's a wrong assumption. I think that's a wrong assumption. I think that it depends. It's one way or the other, right? It's either active investing. It's like I'm going to work for myself and I'm going to grow this company. Or to your point, I'm going to be absentee. And so I'm either looking for something that has management in place, or I know the manager. I prefer this route. I know the manager. I know that level 5 leader that has that experience that's going to be able to come in and take something to the next level. And if I will not be an absentee owner, if I don't have the manager before I find the company, that I turn it around. Private equity will do the opposite. They'll go out and buy companies and then pull from their bench and recruit for management because they've got all this capital that they need to deploy. I'm the opposite. I want to know who's the leader. Then let's go find the business that fits that person. Those are the only instances where I will be an absentee owner.
But not a business that already has a leader in place.
So, I mean, if you're looking at acquisitions, so I live in the space that's sort of like 500,000 to 2 million in discretionary earnings. Call it adjusted EBITDA if that makes you more comfortable. They're slightly different, but I like to play under private equity. The reason for that is really twofold. One, I pay lower multiples. Because two, there's not a bunch of buyer competition flooding in saying I don't have to compete with other people. I'll sit there and hang out and talk with the owner who wants to leave. Okay. And I'm trying to figure out what are they taking with them. Right. So, I mean, I think also paying those lower multiples adds to that kind of margin of safety with the business model.
So I'm thinking not about the ownership or executive strategic leadership. I'm thinking about the operational side. And I'm probably mostly now thinking from my own head versus our clients, the people and necessarily our listeners. I'm like, oh, I'm really great at helping them the strategy and setting some direction and helping build the team, but should never be involved in the operation.
Yes, I understand. Well, there's also the E-Myth, right? Like there's that person that builds the pie shop because they're great at making pies, and they turn out I'm not good at making pies at all, and they need that business person. And so, a lot of times you get the craftsman that is actually the entrepreneur in these smaller businesses. And, that to me is a big transferability issue. And how do I pull that around? What are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about what it is you're buying, what kind of leadership. We're talking more about the people side of what should be in or not be in the thing. And I think what I'm hearing anyway is that you want to think about what role you're going to play.
That's right.
How hands-on, what kind
and I do want you to work in business, but I want you to focus on the growth opportunity. So in other words, let's say you're really good at B2B sales. The company you're looking for shouldn't have a B2B sales component to it, or it should not be performing well, or that's what you bring to the table. Whereas you need to find a business where you're not working in the business in that way, because what you need to be doing is focusing on the growth. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I heard of a friend of a friend who was also a coach, and then they started franchising other things, and then they just were the coach for all the companies that they were buying into and franchising.
Perfect example.
It was like their role was.
I mean, ultimately, it's what's your highest and best use, right? And I mean, it could be running operations. It could, I often think that there's really only two kinds of people. There's revenue generators and profit maximizers. So you're either doing marketing and sales and strategy, or you're doing, operations and accounting and strategy. You know what I mean? It's those two extremes. Yes, there's, other components to it, but where do you live? And then find a business that has the other piece already kind of moving, because that's ultimately what you get to buy. Yeah. And then
well, I'm also reminded one of my favorite entrepreneurs out there for so many reasons is Richard Branson. And what I noticed that's great about so many of Richard's businesses compared to some of the things that I've done and some of the things that our clients have done is that he just goes into an industry that already exists and he makes it cooler. He makes it better, right? Like he didn't invent the airplane. He's like, airline should be more fun. Let's bring some fun to it. British Airways sucks, so I'm going to start Virgin, right? The record companies are leaving all kinds of interesting acts and not maximizing the sales and key things. And he starts Virgin Records, right? And I think that's one of the things.
He's amazing.
Cool.
I got to see him speak at wherever I was, and I felt like I know him as a sort of a personality. And I sort of know what he owns, but I didn't quite have the perspective until I saw him, and I was blown away. Now, the thing is that one of the biggest objections that I don't even get it directly. It sort of comes indirectly around the buy then build model. Is it's like, well, creativity and starting a new thing is sort of part of entrepreneurship. And so sort of like buying something feels like you're kind of cheaping out on, that creativity piece to it. And what I want to say to that is I strongly disagree, first and foremost. And as you can see from some of the things that I've done, what I like to do is really marry the old economy industry with the new economy industry. Like, what are the things that I can take from the new economy that we live in and apply to the old economy and build something tremendously awesome? When you look at Jeff Bezos, Amazon, we think of it as a website. It's not. It's a network of warehouses. That's what they're doing. They're running old school stuff right behind the scenes. Tesla is a car company. Okay. So the thing is, I think that, Richard Branson, sort of innovating these companies, these industries that are already there and sort of creating a
right. It's not like they're trying to invent the brand new widget of something, but they're making it better in some way.
That's right. So
I remember the first time I got in the Tesla Model S, and I got in, and the doors opened up, and then the screen was beautiful, and then my friend said, "All right, sit up straight. All right, watch this." And he floored it, and my head snapped back, and of course it was quiet, and I was like, "Holy crap!" And I grew up. Right, I'm 54, and I grew up seeing all these amazing Detroit concept cars. But Detroit never sold us any of those cars. They made crap, a lot of it. And there were some cool cars in the mix, but there was an awful lot of crap sold to us years. And then they teased us with these concept cars and then sold us the Nova.
The first time I met Jim McKelvey, who's the co-founder of Square, right? Big St. Louis entrepreneur. He's got his new thing here going. One of the first times I met him, he was talking to me about, he had this idea to build a car company. And I have to admit to you, I was like, that guy's wicked smart, but he's got it totally wrong on that. And it wasn't until years later that I saw the Tesla that I was like, oh, Jim McKelvey had it right the whole time. I just couldn't see it. Maybe
the Edsel was going to be a good car.
That's right. That's exactly the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the things I think I'm hearing. There's a lot of companies for there, and it takes a lot of time and effort and trial and error to build some of the core things. So if you can buy that piece of it for some good value, there's capital out there, a lot of different ways to fund it: bank loan, SBA, equity raise, a whole variety of things like that. And then you could bring some of whatever it is that makes you special. What's your secret sauce? And then you can bring that into it. You can leverage new technology, new tools, new ways of looking at the world and the industry to make that better. So build, right? That's the title of the book: Buy, Then Build.
Bill, if I was going to bring it to a head, this is what I would say. You're exactly right. What I would say is, we have, baby boomers own more companies than any generation in the history of mankind. They're retiring at the rate of 10,000 per day. And that's going to increase. And it's going to last for the next 19 years. Okay. There's a huge amount of inventory coming up for sale. It's estimated there's $10 trillion in business value that needs to change hands. So the confluence of the baby boomers retiring, the easiest access to capital we've ever had, it's no longer a constraint, and the proliferation of online marketing is creating, in my mind, probably the opportunity of our lifetime.
Great, yeah. So Walker Deibel, buythenbuild.com. If they want to go find out more about Walker and your book and your work, go to buythenbuild.com. It's all there. It's been a real pleasure, super stimulating, relevant, I think, for our listeners, our clients, and for me personally. So I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too, Bill. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Reminder to our listeners, we're here every week with a new episode talking to somebody about the whole world of scaling up and developing yourself as a leader, developing your company, all four areas of getting your strategy right, the people, the execution, the cash, all dialed in and working well. We're out for software-like multiple growth, growth of profit, and time, making your whole journey as the entrepreneur easier and more fun. So that's our goal. That's what we're out. That's what we promise. You'll find all that at scalingcoach.com. We've now got over 160 episodes out there. You can go search through them, find something on a subject that's of interest to you, listen to it on your next run, drive, airplane flight, scalingcoach.com. We've also got downloads of all of our tools there, and I'll give you a copy of the book for free. You just pay the shipping and handling, and I'll give you a copy of Scaling Up for free so you can get started scaling up. Scalingcoach.com is our address. Thanks again, Walker. Talk to everybody next week.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Don't forget to register now for our next workshop on scaling up. To get one of our limited $100 discounts for our podcast listeners while supplies last, just go to scalingcoach.com/workshops and then enter the code SUP. That's SUP for Scaling Up Podcast when you register. We'll see you there. Special thanks to the original growth guru, Vern Harnish. This show is produced by Lucy Summers, and audio production is done at Podfly Productions. Audio editing is done by Albert Burge, and our show notes are compiled by Ann Codina and proofread by Tim McGowan. If you got some value out of today's show, please share it, pass it along, tell somebody else about the show. Go over to iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you give us a thumbs up and a review. We could really use that. You can let us know the parts that you loved with an email to info@scalingcoach.com, or if you'd love to hear more of something, drop us a line, info@scalingcoach.com. Thanks again for listening, and keep scaling up.